All right. So, yes, it's lovely to hear these stories of goodwill from other people. Um, but I want to talk tonight just about some of the things that can come up when you're doing this practice. Um, and it's kind of it's something that the more you do it, it starts to dredge up some things inside that might look like not what you want. In other words, you might get the sense you're doing it wrong because you may get the opposite that comes up inside you. You may, in trying to give goodwill to yourself, you may find that you feel ill will towards yourself or you feel badly about yourself. So I wanted to normalize that here. I was noticing two things about myself. And these sort of follow me around as these sort of shadowy beliefs. They lurk in there and they're kind of impervious to reason and evidence. But, this one of which is the sense that if people really knew me, they wouldn't like me. That lurks in there somewhere. And it can be a real bummer, I have to say, to feel it and to have it present. So my sense is that is in most of us, something like it. But it's really helpful to see it, to identify it, and to feel it kind of coming up. Another kind of belief that lurks in there inside of me that I was noticing is I have this belief that nobody really wants to hear what I have to say. Now, this might sound really funny to you who've all signed up for a class to hear me talk. Um, and, there may be some relationship here, but it runs quite deep in me, this sense that, and you'd be surprised how often when it comes to teaching this class, it's sort of like there's some little voice that says, oh, Mark, you really have nothing to say. You've said it all. It's like, and there are so many people who know things more worth listening to than you. I don't really have a great story about where it comes from, but I could make one up. I think, has to do with I was raised by a mother who was a talker. And maybe what I actually had to say didn't get a lot of airtime. Though actually I have many memories of her giving me exactly the sort of attention you all have just talked about. She was a powerful benefactor for me in many ways. But there's many sides to people, and there are many sides to us. So I just wanted to identify that just two out of possibly the many things that lurk in the darkness inside of me that many of you might identify with. That yes, this is in me too. And it's part of the process, I believe, of really offering yourself goodwill to kind of see the creatures inside that lurk there. And that is actually part of the basis for learning compassion for everybody else. It's the case that we're actually not that different from each other. I do believe there are some cultural differences. Often, Tibetans don't understand when Westerners talk about self-hatred. They just don't like, huh? I don't get it. So there are some differences, but at least among ourselves in our own culture, we probably contain multitudes. We contain many different versions of ourselves, and some of them are quite unhappy. So letting those arise, letting those be witnessed, letting those be received is really powerful in any way that we can meet them with goodwill. And I thought I'd mention kind of a workaround that is very helpful if you find yourself mired in ill will towards yourself, just not liking yourself for whatever reason. It's partly why we do this benefactor thing. And the more you do it, the more powerful it becomes, because the benefactor is a window toward perceiving yourself differently. When you're in the presence of somebody who really gives you their care and attention, you absorb really in a very bodily way the sense that you're worthy of that attention and care. It may not always make it up to the thought level, but on some level, your body remembers it, and you remember it on deeper levels of your being. And so it's necessary to have those memories and cultivate them as a kind of storehouse of goodwill to call upon when the mind assails us with the "you're no good" narrative, you know, that we may be able to kind of work around our own ill will toward ourselves by recalling people who gave us the feeling that we mattered. I mentioned last week my sixth grade teacher, Mr. Larson. Don't know if I named him, but his name was Mr. Larson. And so actually, I've been working with him a little this week. And you all may recall what it's like to be about 12 years old. And when I think about it, I think about certain characteristics of myself that weren't very flattering. I had a tendency to get kind of arrogant. And I particularly remember that Mr. Larson's son, who I can't remember his name. I think it might have been Eric, but that seems a little too easy to come up with. But I think it was Eric. Was like a year or two younger than me and was in Boy Scouts. And Mr. Larson also came along on some of our trips as a father. And I remember like not being always that nice to him. That kind of meanness that kids can have, I was capable of that too. Of kind of being the older know-it-all. And and I remember being witnessed once in a while by Mr. Larson doing that. And he had a knack, this probably came from being a sixth grade teacher, he had a knack of kind of intervening and redirecting. And I couldn't tell you the words, I couldn't tell you the whatever, but I just remember that there was this skill at, rather than coming down on kids, he had a way of kind of intervening and redirecting. There was very caring, and it just allowed kids to bring out the better sides of themselves instead of the worst sides of themselves. And so when I've been kind of contemplating Mr. Larson this week, I can feel that even though he may have witnessed certain things in me, I didn't feel like that dampened his goodwill. I generally, to this day, feel liked and cared for by him. He's probably not alive anymore. But I can remember that. And it's helpful for me to remember him. And maybe that's the reason he's coming up right now, is because it's helpful sometimes to remember people who showed you kindness when you weren't your best self, when you were, manifesting various kinds of unskillful states, which we all do. So I want to mention that really the benefactor can be a powerful way of like turning things around a bit and finding kind of the stance by which to approach certain characteristics that we have that might be the basis for us thinking that we're unlovable or unlikable. Though I actually think that some of that has no basis whatsoever. It's not based in real traits. It's just based in this sort of fear, social fear of not lovable. The other thing I think also kind of want to mention is that as we offer goodwill to ourselves, on a level that might be mostly unconscious, the Western tendency, the psychotherapeutic tendency is to always ascribe everything to bad experiences that happen to us as children. It isn't so good at talking about the traces left in our being from our unskillful actions themselves. We tend to want to be perpetrators. We tend to want to be victims. We don't tend to want to be perpetrators. We don't want to be open to those moments when we were cruel, when we were indifferent. And yet I think that they stay inside of us in this kind of soup, psychic soup that we are. And they create a kind of a stench, if I can put it that way. Just, this kind of feeling like, oh, I'm not a very good person, which may not have a lot of specific content to it. Once in a while, we'll catch ourselves and do something, and then like, okay, there it is. But it can kind of follow us around, this kind of feeling of, oh, I'm not a very good person. I'm not actually very loving, kind of self-absorbed and selfish, and all these sorts of things. They kind of float around there. And there are traces of our actions that are inside of us. And to be Buddhist about it with former lifetimes, there's also the sense that one can be carrying things from former lives one doesn't even remember that prime you to feel certain ways about yourself. You don't need to know what they are necessarily. Don't have to do past life regressions. Go ahead if you're drawn to that. You can actually just notice them in yourself and begin the process, the long process of letting that be conscious and letting it be met by that attitude that I tried to kind of talk about in the meditation we just did at the beginning of this class, which is, first of all, just let them be met by a non-judgmental awareness. Oh, there you are. There it is. So, you're kind of in that, just letting them be that way. You're actually practicing quite a bit of restraint from the more judging parts of you to just not just, okay, just see that. Just kind of offer it goodwill. We start with the body because actually I think there's a lot of karma in the body and we don't even need to know what it is. But we can begin to melt a whole lot of ill will by just treating our body well. I don't just mean like taking care of ourselves, going to the gym. I mean mentally. Treating our aches and pains, our injuries, our limitations, our physical limitations with kindness, with compassion, and with goodwill. Our bodies are trying their hardest. Animals are really a great way to learn goodwill too. And partly the reason for that is we don't project as much on them. We assume that our animals are trying their best for the most part. Once in a while, we'll about them, but for the most part, we cut them a lot of slack. And so our bodies kind of slips in there, I think, in the same category, that it's fairly easy for us to believe that our bodies are trying their hardest to do what we're asking them to do under the limitations that they have, the genetic limitations they have, the histories of past accidents, and even some of the abuse we've given them by, eating the wrong things, or not exercising them, whatever we've done. Our bodies are doing the best they can. So they can become like this place of refuge, if you will, where if we can do nothing else, we can go through and we can send our body goodwill. And it's a powerful thing. And I think it touches many deep places of karma in us, just to like, okay, there's tension. Send it goodwill, feel it. Just actually give it attention, unjudgmental attention. and just the little bit of warmth from the heart of, oh dear, you're really trying and hurting, you know. I've been having a lot of sinus pain. I don't exactly know why this year it's so much more than other years. I could come up with a story about that. I don't really have one. Um, but it is helpful to just meet that sometimes with the sense those sinuses are trying to do what they're trying to do, for my benefits. And the hurt part of it is not their fault. And the fact it's unpleasant, I'll maybe figure out something better to do. But there it is. And it doesn't help to meet that with aversion. So when you offer goodwill to yourself, and these sort of latent, unwholesome seeds, that you see sprout in you kind of come up, you can meet them with that same attitude of, this is suffering. This is suffering. And here's what's kind of, I think, amazing is that this is not the way that we tend to think so much in the West, but when someone, for instance, does something offensive to you or around you, and it raises this kind of inside, it's so easy for us to think that that person caused it. But in a deeper level, that person's action merely makes our own unwholesome seeds go like this inside. Our own tendencies towards, say, being rude or arrogant or whatever it is that we see in front of us. It's actually something being touched inside of us that is producing the reactivity. And we're not very well trained to pay attention to that. We're much more trained, or it just comes much more easy to see what the other person is, judge them, feel ill will toward them, whatever. So it's very much the case that the suffering that people produce in us, the triggers, if you will, they're touching something here. It's very much the case in modern psychology to talk about it in terms of your childhood wounding. That can be a very skillful thing to know about, like the ways that somebody else's action kind of resonates inside, the ways that those things hurt that you felt. But I'd like to also have you be open to the possibility that what is also touching inside of you is your own inner tendencies, however well you've hidden them, to those same traits. And here's the danger of being a good person. If I can put it this way, there's a danger to being a good person, because often being a good person means that you have been raised well and you have learned to push aside some of the nastier sides of yourself. And that's a wonderful thing. I don't want to complain about it, because thank goodness people are raised that way so that we're not all acting out our worst impulses on each other. But those things are still in there. And so when you're a good person and you're kind of like, okay, I won't act that way around other people, and you do this in a very kind of immediate way, but then somebody else doesn't do that. And it raises this kind of outrage inside of you that they're not suppressing the thing that you're so good at suppressing. It makes you really mad. So if we can trace that back, I think it's Byron Katie has this thing about if you're pointing your finger at someone, there's one finger pointing at someone else, and there's three pointing back at you. It's very helpful. I don't even know if it's true, but it's usually, there's some truth. There's at least one finger pointing back at you that says that very trait that's enraging me in someone else is really, it's a part of my psyche too. It really is. And so that can soften the whole situation. And the more you do that, the less you're going to be aroused by someone else in that way. So maybe I'll go down this road just a little tonight, but I think that we are in for it in the next 4 years, because there's someone on the national stage who is going to act out all sorts of impulses that we as good people would never want to at least be publicly seen doing, but even wouldn't ever want us ever to be privately doing. And it's going to produce a great deal of inside. It's already doing it, I believe. It's already doing it. So my sense is this is an opportunity for us to become warriors, spiritual warriors, really, in this coming era, that we have, got to somehow be able to field some of this and meet it in a skillful way. That's about as far as I'm going to go tonight, because in some ways I feel like, oh my goodness, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. But the essence of it is what I've already presented, is that it's the slow course of, noticing the things that bother you in other people and tracing them back to the unwholesome seeds inside of yourself, just beginning to do that. So I got a little ahead of myself, because that's going to be some of the classes will go in terms of practice further on. But I just felt like, in terms of giving the whole picture of the difficulty of loving oneself, that's definitely a part of it. We'll be moving towards like loving the other people further on, but this also might help you get through Thanksgiving, if I can be so direct. I know that oftentimes gatherings of family are difficult for people, and there are traits that just send people through the roof. So this is like your warrior training coming up, if that's you. I happen to think my Thanksgiving is going to be not like that at all, in terms of the people that I'm with, at least on Thursday. It might be on Saturday when I'm more with my family, but this is your opportunity to kind of like even keep a notebook. I mean, if you got one of those little notebooks in your pocket, pull it out, write it down. This drives me nuts. This thing provoked a reaction. Just write it down. You don't have to think about it too much. Put it back. If somebody asks you what you're writing down, you said, there was a thought I had I didn't want to lose. That's enough. I wouldn't tell them what you're doing. And even if it doesn't happen on Thanksgiving, as you are kind of going through your week, you might just jot it down. Like, what was it that got a rise out of me? Because that is what's going to be your treasure in terms of unbinding your heart from what other people do and say, in order to really rest in goodwill and goodness. It's not easy. It's really a long path, but that's kind of the beginning of it. It's as simple as what Jesus said, judge not lest you be judged, that when you find yourself judging someone else, it unconsciously is judging you at the same time. You can't really separate that. People like to talk about oneness in spiritual circles. Well, this is oneness. This is the oneness. This is you can't judge someone else without it coming back at you. You can't dislike someone else without it coming back from you. It's really part of the training. But there's an enormous advantage if you know that. Enormous advantage if you know that, of like working with what's inside of you and finding that feeling inside of safety in the presence of another human being through your benefactor. It's just golden. And pretty soon, if you bask in that, you'll want to offer it to others. It's really natural. And eventually, and again, don't get too ambitious too soon. Eventually, you may offer that to people who are difficult. That kind of goodwill, but in general, the teaching has you start with what's easy and move towards what's difficult, because it's really a process. It's not a simple, one-step thing. And so you can start that by kind of like also noticing your own, the things that maybe you go inside about when you notice that. Can you meet that with goodwill? Can you meet that with, just non-judgmental witnessing? What this begins to lay, if I can say it, is you start to touch into the ground of unconditional acceptance and goodwill, which I actually think is in each of us, but it's not very accessible often in any of us. But there is a level of our mind. Some traditions call it Buddha nature. Theravada tradition doesn't have a really handy word for it, I have to say. Unfortunately, I envy Mahayana for having a simple word like Buddha nature for it. But it is also in this Theravada tradition that, you can become as cruel as possible and do all sorts of horrible things, and you will never get rid of the potential for goodness and the connection that exists between your heart and everyone else. You'll never be able to lose it. You can't lose it. However, through practice, and this kind of blows my mind sometimes when I contemplate it, when I contemplate the different levels of awakening, that it's actually possible to become free of ill will and have it never arise again through a level of awakening. And this is not virtue. This is not like trying really hard and suppressing all the not loving things in yourself. It's about awakening to the point where you can no longer perceive the world such that ill will makes any sense. Just like you wouldn't pick up a hot coal because you could see it so clearly as a hot coal. You wouldn't pick up ill will towards someone else because it just absolutely made no sense. So that kind of level of mind is everyone's potential, and I think it's actually already present. We just maybe don't have access to it. But as we do this practice of goodwill, we start to touch into it. I think of it sometimes as like backing up into our open heart, the vastness of our open heart is capable of compassion, capable of infinite compassion and kindness. We kind of sometimes back into it by working in this more immediate way with the traits that are in us. And once in a while, we'll just kind of pop into it, we'll pop into that kind of basic level of the heart's nature, which is one of connection and compassion itself. It's not something any of us lack. It's more just something we're not practiced at accessing, and that we have a lot of stuff in the way. So that's where we are in terms of this. So just by way of just concluding, and then we're going to do just a little more meditation. What I suggest for this week, continue the benefactor. If you haven't done it yet, do it. It's a great place to begin. And then maybe just start to keep a few notes about seeing the different things in yourself that might trigger you towards ill will towards yourself. Just a little, okay? And see if you can actually hold them with any sort of equanimity and goodwill. That would be my suggestion. And, continue to do the meditation. All right. And I think the one that I recorded this week will be really helpful for just kind of that sense of goodwill toward the body and finding maybe that kind of glow, that sense of glow where you just have enough goodwill going. There's a little bit of that in you. And then the benefactor also gives you that feeling of what that kind of glow of receiving goodwill is, just to be able to get any of that. All right.